starts with an I story, really, because in the fall of 2000, I met Ellen in a class. I was working on a master's degree, and I wanted a reading endorsement, and I had taken all of my all the reading classes as electives as my undergrad. So I was looking for a class, and a friend said, "Hey, take a class from this Arwood lady. She's got some cool ideas." And at the time, I was a reading specialist at Astor, and I was doing my thing, that I'd learned in my undergrad time, not getting great results, but it was okay. And I took this class, and she basically pushed back and said, "Nah, pretty much what you're doing is not going to work." And she was pretty much right, but I was like, "Are you kidding me? What do you mean? This is not what anyone has told me." And so I started to shift some of the work, and it was the second year of my master's program, and so I was doing a few different things, and it was working. Kids were doing well enough that I even brought her into Astor to talk and everything. And then I got one of my first full-time job in a classroom in fall of 2001. And I worked that year with the kids. I had a reading endorsement, I had a master's degree, I had everything I knew. And 42% of the kids did not meet reading benchmarks that year. And it was honestly the most vulnerable populations. It was the ESL kids, 75% of them didn't meet. And although that was okay, and my principal wasn't particularly dismayed, I wasn't very happy about it. Because either kids can learn or they can't. And if we're okay with 40% of our kids not learning, then that's not a model I really want to be a part of. So I called Ellen and I said, "Hey, can you please come help me? I'll do anything you say. I got to do something different here." And so we started to collaborate interprofessionally. And what really happened was we brought in a lot. She started to get me thinking more about what is the acquisition of language and how do we do that in an elementary classroom, as opposed to what are all the skills you can teach kids to try to get them to learn to read. Okay, there's a big shift there. And that shift happens over about 3 years, and I'm still tweaking and working and doing whatever I can to help someone learn. But over that 3 years, there was a dramatic difference by the fourth year. 90 to 95% of the students were all passing the district-required tests. From that time on, they continued to learn very well. There was a lot of difference in the kids. And from that came accolades and various honors. But as the years went on, I started to get a little frustrated. Because here's what I heard. "That's so great. Bonnie's just a great teacher." "Oh, Bonnie's just a great teacher." "Well, we can't all be Bonnie. Bonnie's just a great teacher." And I was like, because inside I'm thinking, I knew it was something more than that. Because there's a lot of great teachers out there they pour their heart and soul into this job. They work 15 hours a day. They agonize over every kid. So it's more than just being a great teacher. And so the doctoral program came along, and I was really hesitant. I had a 2-year-old. I was working full time, and a couple people basically filled out my application and said, "You're going to do it." And so I did. And really what it meant for me was that power to start saying, okay, if it's more than just me being a great teacher, what is it? What's going on? And it really opened up an opportunity for me to dig into those 3 bases in literature that Ellen just explained to you. To figure out what does what's out there say about language, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience, to pull it all together and maybe even give me some answers and help me explain it. So that's my I story about how this all came to be. It really is the culmination of 15 years of changing, thinking, questioning, agonizing, arguing, you name it, I've done it, okay, with lots of different people. So when you start to think about research, you got to identify a problem. And we've got some problems out there. Notice that whenever there is some little words, okay, these little guys. All right, that's the research I'm talking about. Everything I'm going to talk about today is found in the literature. A couple people in here have actually read the 60-page literature review, because Ellen's right. Of the 178 pages without references, I won't count those, that we are asked to write, 65 to 70 of mine, I think closer to 70 is the lit review. Foundationally, it had to be pulled together. So I can say with all honesty, I've done the legwork here, and I've laid eyes on this literature, okay? So we have some problems out there where kids are struggling, okay? I've met kids in the last 20 years, how many of you have worked with them who already feel like failures when they're 6? I can't draw, I can't read, I can't write. And then, so that kind of got me thinking, if that's the case, if kids aren't feeling like they can read, write, think, talk, do anything successfully, then there might be a mismatch between what we're doing in the schools and maybe how kids learn. Because there's been a lot of diagnoses, and if somebody disagrees with these numbers, I think you probably have actually seen this in the field, yes? That there's some serious shifts going on, okay? So when you look at that, you say, well, there's so much more diagnosis of all these different labels and deficits in kids. The question is why? And really what we determined was, it's very possible, it actually is true, that there's a lack of alignment between what the literature tells us in neuroscience and language and all the other areas, how we learn and what's going on, and what we're actually doing. Because if those things matched, kids would be learning, and we wouldn't be having these discussions. Everyone would just be all happy and learning to read, okay? So there is a lack of alignment between the education community and what's in the literature. Okay? And part of that is that there isn't a lot of acknowledgement of this recent neuroscience research on those processes of learning. Not memory or attention, but actually how do we learn? There is, of course, what Ellen mentioned, that there's this mind-brain education initiative. Mind-brain education. So what's missing there? Language, okay? There's a lot out there, and I started to dig through it because I thought, okay, mind-brain education, yay, they're on the right track. None of those articles mention language. None of them. It's just literally a straight jump from neuroscientists making recommendations for the classroom. Occasionally a teacher is there. That's about it, okay? So we really are showing a gap between what the literature says and what we're doing in the classroom. Because really, we're not integrating what we know into classroom applications. So, contrasting to mind-brain education, of course, we have Dr. Arwood's Neuro-Education model. This is the theoretical framework used in my study. This framed the whole entire lit review and framed the interpretation of the literature base. Right? But remember that when you look at cognitive psych and neuroscience, really language is the mediating factor to how we think and how our mind works, how our brain works and how our mind works. And I'll explore that more in the next few minutes. So truly, the overall purpose of this study was to see what does the literature say about how we learn in the literature, as opposed to what's happening, and then how do we align that to think of a new way of doing things, okay? We don't want to just keep doing what we've always done, because if it works, we get a lot different results than what we're getting, all right? So we have this review of literature. I could probably, if I went through it in detail, that could probably be a 6-hour class. Actually, it's kind of like a culmination of 12 hours of the neuroeducation program. So I'm going to give it to you in nutshells, little tidbits that we can think about it, okay? So what I really wanted to do was to figure out how we got where we are today. Why do we do certain things, and where did that start? So the beginning of the lit review is to say, what historical underpinnings got us to where we are today? Or another way to say that is to say, we have certain beliefs about teaching and learning. Where did that come from? Okay? So specifically, I wanted to know what is language from the 3 areas of the neuroeducation model. What is language acquisition? How does that happen? What is learning? And then how do those 3 things relate to the acquisition of literacy? Remembering literacy is reading, writing, thinking, speaking, viewing, calculating. Okay? So when I explored the question of what is learning from those 3 areas, they were pretty much in agreement that true learning is an actual change, a permanent change, something that you take with you wherever you go. Okay? Now, what was really cool was that the literature was clear that it takes the social interaction with language to acquire any kind of that permanent change. There's a lot of this is a very sad thing, but there's a lot of information and articles written about children who have no social interaction. And their neural structures are completely different. So that alone tells us that without social interaction, a child will not acquire language. Therefore, they do not acquire neural structures. One basically happens with the other. So then the question is, what is language? Now this is a fun one. I would pose this to any of you. Like, what is language? And so as I massaged literature and got lots of rewrites from my chair, we talked about the fact that language is truly, our oral language is very symbolic, and it has purpose, it has some emphasis and pragmatics, but basically it's an agreed upon symbol, a symbolic representation of our concepts, okay? So if I point to there and I say table, and you say, oh, it's a table, and I say, yep, that's a table, we've just shared language, okay? We've shared that symbolic representation of our concept, all right? And it has to be for a purpose, and it's represented by interconnected neural networks of circuits, okay? It's very, very clear that in the neuroscience literature that if you're using language, the whole brain lights up. People with restricted language, not as much brain activity, okay? So the fact that that occurs when we're sharing meaning tells us what language is. Right? Okay, but notice here we got a little purse in there. Oh, yeah. His stuff will rock your world. I'm just telling you. I don't know how he thought this way, but his foundational work in what is language, he tried to break it down scientifically. It was brilliant. Like, what is language? And to read it, you're like, oh, wow, dude, that was 18, the first one's like 1880s, 60s, 1880s.
Yeah.
Of course, he was totally not accepting his time and ended up basically being supported by, who was his friend? Which guy who Dewey liked. Yeah, he ended up basically living off of a friend at his later life. William James. So the process of language acquisition was reviewed in the literature, which we know there's a strong connection between language acquisition learning and the neural structures of the brain. And the neurosemantic language learning theory represents the overlap of those three phenomena in a very succinct and beautiful way. All right? So this is what you've encountered before. I just wrote in a different slide, and I threw some more references in case. The real power here is that a lot of us worked with Ellen for a long time, and we know she's brilliant and fantastic. And it was really amazing to get into the literature and realize she's also completely, utterly, and totally right. Because she's supported from every single angle by the literature. Okay, this is not a guessing game. It's not just an informed opinion. When you pull it all together, it's there. All right. So I pulled a few more recent people in. So we know that the sensory receptors receive sensory information, and when the sensory information is recognized, then named through social interaction, which is my research boyfriend Vygotsky there. He's awesome. I love that. So many quotes in my dissertation from it. So this perceptual patterns connect into strong neural pathways. When enough patterns are named and become meaningful, they overlap, forming strong neural circuits, which form concepts. And Pulvermüller is the one who's really showing that now. Okay, he actually said that language in the brain is the connection of circuits and networks. Therefore, if you're a linguist, why aren't you studying neuroscience? Okay, if you work with language, why aren't you talking to the neuroscientists? And he's one of the people that's not making a lot of assumptions. He's actually reporting it, because a lot of the neuroscience kind of like messed with by our biases. Okay? So the acquisition of concepts is the beginning of cognition, and then continued meaningful language experiences allow circuits to form networks of neurons which equal language functions in a nutshell. Okay, and this is the neurobiological learning system. And this, of course, is a very important factor in the research. So once again, language equals literacy. All right? As early as the 1960s, researchers found strong correlation between the use of language in preschool-age children and their future acquisition to literacy function. As early as the 60s, people have kept doing it. There is so much current research out there. Preschool language, predictive of 4th grade achievement scores. It is out there. They keep finding it. So why do we ignore that at our own peril? Okay, the acquisition of language absolutely will impact literacy. So neuroscience finds that literacy processes require the activation of large areas of the brain, which I said, which is needed for literacy. So the people that are reading and writing and doing language tasks with all those little sensors hooked up are showing activation of large areas of the brain because they're using their language to do the literacy tasks. Okay? So language function and neural structures have a direct impact on the acquisition of literacy, on those processes. Neural function and language function have a direct impact on the acquisition of literacy. So this is where my background came in that I was engaged every day in helping young children acquire literacy. So this is kind of where my area goes into what I was working on in the classroom. So this is the literature review. in a nutshell. You're welcome. There's a lot. But research questions, so I formulated 4 research questions from the literature and from the problem statement. And it really started with me working out in the world, in the real world. I don't work in a bubble. And there are certain things we do, a lot of. And I was asking that question, why? Where does this come from? And if we do it and we embrace certain things, what is the theoretical basis for it? Once again, getting out of my opinions, my beliefs, what I think, my gut feeling. What does the literature say about what we're doing? Okay? That really was that knee-jerk reaction to me. People like, well, you're just reflecting on your own practice, or you're just Bonnie and you're great. No. What does the literature say about what we're doing? It's not my opinion anymore. Okay? So I started out by deciding what are some things we do in elementary school and elementary practice, and then what are those theoretical frameworks? If we go in literature and say, this thing we do, where does it match in the literature? Okay? And then I grouped the things that were similar and found those theoretical similarities and created a tenet behind it. Like, what is this belief we have and what's it grounded in? And then what are the practices that match it? All right? And I made some tables and figures to show that. So here's just a start. All right? Often our practices are so accepted we don't question them anymore. So it reminds me of a joke my friend told me, and this is the joke. So 2 young fish are swimming in the ocean, and the old fish swims by and says, how's the water? And the young fish say, what's water? Right? We don't even know to ask the question. This is not questioned. You do this in the classroom, nobody will question you. Okay? We have to ask the questions. All right? So in order to even say there might be something different, we have to identify what's out there. Okay? We have to say, what's the water? So here are some current tenets that we work with. Input, output, learning. All right? This is clear. Psychology, information is given in one form. A psychological process occurs, whatever that is. The same information is given back by the student, the same modality. That's input, output. And behaviorism tells us that outward behavior can be controlled and reinforced with evidence of learning occurring when correct outward behavior is repeated. Okay? That's programming. If you don't think this is common, look at what's out there, what's published. And then just a few manifestations in the classroom. That was one thing I discovered. That was in the literature. Okay? Next, reductionist teaching. This is very common. Behaviorism. All behavior and therefore learning can be reduced to its smallest components and then taught. Cognitive psychology suggests that smaller units of meaning create larger units of meaning. And this is in the literature.
It's the additive principle.
A deficit-based intervention. Psychology tells us that we have norm reference ranges of performance. That means someone has to fail and somebody has to win. That's what that tells us. Behaviorism, standardized delivery of instruction will remediate any observable deficiencies. If we can have the same input, we'll get the same output. Hence, standardized scripted curriculum. Okay. Theory of mind. Whew, there's a lot of literature out here. So the interpretation of underlying psychological meaning of observable behaviors. Anything trying to ascertain the impact of memory, attention, effort, mindset, perception, self-regulation, preference, confidence, or any psychological processes is theory of mind. And that's us deciding what you're thinking based on what we see. That's what that is. And if you don't think that's happening, you can come visit my building anytime and listen to what they talk about in the staff lounge. Because teachers do this all the time. Okay, products as evidence of learning. Behaviorism says that products are evidence of learning when they match the expected output of a learning environment. I say cat, you say cat, you just learn. That's straight input output behaviorism. Cognitive psychology says observable behaviors are also products of learning. Okay? My most annoyance in the classroom is the whole idea of predetermined learning outcomes. In 1910, Dewey said that was Irish bull. He said, how dare you tell a learner what they will learn? You are not treating them like a human being if you do that. So I'm about ready to tell I already told my principals, you got to show me literature to show me why I should do that, because I'm not going to be doing it. Doesn't mean as a teacher it's a free-for-all. It means that as a teacher I know what's going on, but you're not going to tell me to put goals on the board. We do it with adults, and even that's pushing it. But at least as an adult, you can be like, oh, that's just a guideline. I'll learn other things. But kids don't know that. They believe you, right? They think there's only one thing they have to learn. So in the dissertation, the figures, I learned that there's a difference between table and a figure, by the way. This is not a table, figure. Woo, the things you learn when you write dissertations. So this is how it actually looked. It was all put together. Okay, all the things we just talked about. So the discussion of this, the implications from this is that the current prevalent educational practices have a theoretical basis in three major schools of thought: psychology, cognitive psychology, and behaviorism. That's what we have. That's what we're working with. That is culturally ingrained and a very strong inherent bias in our system. So we got to call it out. All right?
It's the water in the fishbowl.
It's the water in the fishbowl. Okay? Now these three areas are very, very widespread. So my question is, great. Okay, if that's what we're working in, how's it working? How's it working out for us? Okay, so here's how it's working out for us. I took this straight off the web. Now, the National Assessment of Educational Progress really likes to show you the graph from 1980 till now, because the line kind of goes up, okay? But it goes up from horribly abysmal to abysmal. Started at like 15%, now it's at abysmal. F is an F. So if we look at this in reading, fourth graders nationwide, only 36% or more are proficient, considered proficient. 36%. How many are failing? 64. I don't think that's good in anybody's book, okay? And if you disaggregate that data, it's worse for any vulnerable population, right? Okay, so then math, tiny bit better. 40% of kids are able to use the literacy process of calculation. Still not great, okay? It is not great. So then the question is, if it's not working for most kids, then what will, all right? So that leads to research question number 2, which says, what new ways of thinking could we shift to that are actually aligned with the Neuro-Education Conceptual framework and are found within the literature? So if I'm telling you that we're working in a system that's clearly not working, then I feel as a researcher I should provide an alternative. So I dug through the literature to find that alternative. What could we find instead? So the review of literature is very simple. The methodology is very similar. It was based in the literature. I'm going to look for common themes regarding the process of learning. And I found 3 basic tenets that represent that neuroeducation overlap regarding learning language and literacy. Okay? And I also matched that with classroom practices. Now, I do have the privilege of being able to spend a lot of time tweaking my classroom practices. Now, this allowed me to take what I have and find out, okay, so if I'm doing a flow chart, how does that align with literature? So I was able to do that with my background. Okay, so here's an example of how it looked in the dissertation. And so here are the 3 major theoretical areas I was able to find. Okay? Learning is a conceptual process. All right? Social constructivism says that learners acquire concepts through the process of meaningful social interaction, and the use of language is a conceptual process. And neuroscience tells us that the structures of the brain are acquired through the process of the acquisition of language that represents concepts, which then confirms the work of the language theorists. So this, learning is a conceptual process, very strong in the literature, and you can see the manifestation in the classroom practices. Then I decided to take the same neuroeducation Venn diagram model and put that into the Venn diagram model. And what we find here is that, in the center, that a learning environment needs to be conceptually based and process focused. The reason I did this is I don't want a bunch of people trying to copy my methods. That is not systemic, okay? What I want to say is that if you can apply this to any classroom setting, you are following a neuroeducation learning model. So I was looking for that bigger picture that would apply to multiple situations. So the next one I found in the literature was a semantic learning model. Okay? Language theory tells us that learners begin to acquire new concepts by forming semantic or meaningful relationships between the known idea and the unknown idea. And neuroscience evidence shows the brain will create efficient pathways for information processing using the strength of their neural structures through the meaning, what they find meaningful. Okay? And everyone creates their own unique meaning. So this manifests here. In the center, it's a learning environment that is meaningful and strength-based, which is the opposite of the deficit-based culture we currently work in. So the final tenet that I worked in, this one actually had the broadest representation in the literature, which is shocking why we don't embrace it more, which is the function of the whole. So language theory says the structure or parts of oral language only represent what we have, the conceptual acquisition. Only when a whole concept has been acquired can the concept be represented with oral language. Pragmaticism supports this theory by adding that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, because functional use of language represents deep understanding of layers of interconnected semantic relationships. Psycholinguists, they were great. They didn't really have the classroom applications to move their work along, but they had some great stuff. Agree, because they say that they connect literacy to this by asserting that only knowing the whole meaning of a word can reading occur because the underlying concept supports the use of those structures. You cannot access literacy till you understand what it means, basically. And they were right. And finally, neuroscience has found that language is represented by neural networks that use many regions of the whole brain, representing a synergy between the different areas. Synergistic whole brain learning. There is no left and right brain. Well, there is, but it all works together. And so the model says that a semantic-based learning environment is an environment that's meaningful and strength-based. Okay, whatever environment you're in. Okay, so question 3 said, well then, how do literacy processes align with the neuroeducation approach? So I was thinking, okay, if this model is foreign literature, can we find aspects of literature through the classroom work? Okay, so in order to do this, I transcribed 6 different 30 to 35-minute lessons. Okay. Then I analyzed the transcripts through the 3 lenses, looking for features of language, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. And then certain terms began to emerge, and I was able to create a coding system. So, for example, here's a transcript from something I did in the classroom, we were myrmecologists learning about ants. And first thing I did was go through it, and I tried to basically narrate what was happening from those 3 lenses. So I was like, okay, what's happening here that's cognitive psychology? We're activating prior knowledge. That's definitely memory, cognitive psychology. All right, so then I can see that we're using functional language as we start to talk together about what we're going to learn. I can see that the cross-modal sensory input of me drawing while I talk is allowing the neurobiological access. So as I went through, I found that those 3 things were happening a lot. Within that coding, I found other terms emerging through my analysis. And I found that, for example, within language, I had noticed that there was increased semanticity when I noted that there was functions of language occurring. Or when I noted that the cross-modal information was going in, that the brain could receive the sensory information. Okay? So I started to find these secondary terms in the in my own analysis. Okay, this is very raw data here, but I wanted to show you how this occurred. Those of you who would like this type of. So what came out of that was the fact that we have the neuroeducation with the 3 different areas, and from that I saw neurocognitive psychology, language deep structure, and linguistic function. And as I found these within my analysis, within that these more segregated terms are coming out. That within language function, we have these 3 parts from language function, language deep structure, we have these areas. So you see how within each one it got even more drilled down, okay? It was really neat to see those things emerging because I wasn't going into it trying to find that, but it came out once I looked at my own analysis, okay? And then in the dissertation, I also provided examples of the terms I was using in case the reader wasn't sure of what that example was. If you were here at the last one, you actually got a handout with this. Lucky you. Otherwise, you're going to have to read my dissertation and try to find it. All right. And then from that, we created tables. This is the table. The last one was a figure. Okay. What I realized basically was that the evidence was all over the place. In a 30-minute lesson, 2 or 3 times a minute, I was finding evidence of neuroeducation constructs, theories, okay? It was in there. It was happening all the time, all right? And this proved it. So, we have research question 3. So, a lot of researchers have looked at language as the structures, but they haven't looked at it as function. And then how does that functional language influence language acquisition in the classroom? Okay? They haven't really looked at that. I was able to find that within the language of the classroom. I was able to find evidence of language function. Okay? And, there are some great studies out there, really foundational studies like Hart and Risley, and they collected data over 10 years. They transcribed thousands of hours of children interacting with their parents, and they found that children in poverty were not acquiring language. And they tried to, not only did they find out why, but they tried so hard to start a daycare or a preschool to help the children to basically get past that. And as I read their book, I realized what they were missing was they wanted to help the kids, but they helped them by showing them vocabulary words. What they didn't acknowledge in this incredible work, Everyday Differences, Lives of American Children is a fabulous book, is they did not talk about language function in their, how are we going to help the kids, right? They stumbled upon it, but they didn't name it. And that was really fascinating to realize, because their data was fantastic. Okay? So question number 4 said, so if our ability to acquire and use conceptual language will help us acquire literacy, then a classroom that's based upon the acquisition of language should result in some pretty good results. So basically, if we were doing this nationwide, probably more than 40% of kids would know how to read. Okay? And so, we live in an accountability culture. So in a nutshell, are the reading scores going to get better? So that's kind of what I was looking at. So, let me see. Oh, I went backwards. So the methodology was this. Luckily, I had a principal who liked data, so I collected 9 years of data. In a first grade classroom, 40% of the students were English language learners, 75 to 85% free reduced lunch. This is the developmental reading assessment data, which is a proven criterion reference, reliable. Everybody accepts this as a very accurate form of data collection. And so I had September scores and June scores. I did only use clear and intact students because there was a high mobility rate, and I could get kids in, May 15th and have to take a DRN and turn them in. So that didn't really reflect the work. Okay, so there was the methodology. Here's some of the results. I actually took each of the 9 years and made a chart like this. So this represents how many students were in the cohort that year that was clear and intact. By the way, this year there was 28 kids altogether. 22 were intact. That's probably a big year. That's why I put it up here. Some years as low as 16. It actually stayed. So what we see is the beginning score is the first line in September, and then the ending score is June. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with developmental reading assessment, the cutoff for end of year benchmark is approximately 14-16 at the end of first grade. End of second grade is 24-28. I was told to stop after level 28 because second grade teachers wanted some tests for their kids. So I basically stopped at 28. So basically what we're saying here is that these kids ended the year at basically ready for third grade or above. So did these. This is mid to late second grade. This is November, December second grade. All right. And they were supposed to come to me at least a level 2. So although we have some scores here that started at 0 and then went to a 4, that means that they had nothing. That literacy-wise, they didn't have anything. So if they looked at the level 0 DRA is a picture of a bird saying, yes, yes, yes. They have to be able to point and go, yes, yes, yes. After the teacher models it, yes, yes, yes. Level 0 means that going into first grade, they could not do that. Okay? They could not identify yes, yes, no, no, no. All right? So these particular students, upon imitation and modeling, yes, input, output. These students, did they make end of year benchmark? No. But kindergarten expectation was a level 2. So they went from a 0 to a 4. That's more than a year's growth in 9 months. And that's reflected all the way across the board. All right? So I have one of these for every year. And then I have the summative DRA data. So we have year 1, which is when I kind of just went for it on my own. And we have, do I have it there? So this is exceed, this is meet, and this is not meet. And so you can see, that's not so great, that's 40%, and I did not segregate out the ESL for this study because that would have been another section of a lit review, as I've learned. Just, I was already in tears half the time thinking about how much I had to read. So I had to leave out the ESL, it's even more dramatic, trust me. All right, so by the second year, oh well, that darker line is going up there pretty high. And then that continues the whole way. What I find the most dramatic as I look back is how many kids were exceeding. Okay, 70% or so every year. And generally this 5% or 4% is usually one student with some very different neurological impairment. Physical, abuse, traumatic injury, I mean literally great differences, okay? Oh, and the other thing I think I should point out is that as the years went on, our school's SES population got more intense. So when I started out, we were on like 60%, 65% free and reduced lunch. By the end, we were 90. So that was really important, really impact as well. So here we go. Here's my little logic stream. Acquisition of language occurs from learning layers of concepts over time. Functional language acquisition is critical for the acquisition of literacy processes. So functional language processes are utilized in the learning environment, then the data should show steady growth in achievement of all students in a neuroeducation-based environment, which it did. So basically my results were confirmed by the literature, and the literature supported my results. Kind of nice synergy there. So then I went on with, it was very nice when it all wraps up with a neat little bow. All right, so implications for future change. So this was that chapter 5 where we go out on the limb and say, now I have an opinion. So here's my opinion. So a large population of teachers need to understand the impact of language on the learning processes, okay? So pre-service teachers, like Ellen said, they certainly learn how to teach, but they do not know how students learn, all right? So we have a classroom full of brains, and teachers don't learn how the brain works. We have a classroom full of children learning language, and teachers do not learn about language function. Moving forward, we really have to change the way we think about teachers learning before they go out in the field. I did a quick look at every single education program in the greater Portland area. Nobody has functional language classes, and nobody has neuroscience classes for undergrads. Nobody. The only time you'll get anything on language at all is if you're getting ESL endorsement, and it's not functional language, it's linguistics. Okay? For systemic change, we've got to start talking about the impact of language and neuroscience on our practice and how it could change what we do. We need to get the connections with the neuroscience community. Much like Ellen was saying, we need to have them realize the legitimacy of what we're doing. And how, the thing is, when I talk to, as Ellen said, go out on a limb and go to something different, I've gone to some neuroscience conferences now, and they love it. They love seeing us there. They're thrilled. I did a poster, and they were over going, oh my goodness, nobody questioned the neuroscience. Everyone's like, yeah, that's completely right. What are your applications for that? They're being pressured to create applications that don't really work, but they're being pressured as the doctor to make an application. But when they jump from their neuroscience to applications, they're usually completely off the wall. It's not working. Okay, most of the recent stuff out on dyslexia comes straight from Shaywitz, who had great data, interpret it with their biases, as I've shown, that are out there, and now we have classroom applications. But when you read the research, you're like, wow, you just determined that the auditory centers of the brain are a little bit weak in certain students. And look at how much the occipital lobe is lighting up. Their interpretation, we need to strengthen the auditory pathways. Merceness's interpretation, we need to strengthen the auditory pathways. My interpretation, let's use what the kid can do, which is what they can see and what they can feel. And let's do that. You see the difference? So that's what we need. We need those collaborations so that they can see that we as educators are bringing something to the table that they can use. All right, and that's really critical. I'd also love to see if the coding that I found could be found anywhere else. It'd be kind of fun to see if any other transcriptions in neuroeducation classrooms could reveal that level of language function and neuroscience principles. And what I'm proposing right now is that there's a better way to do things. That we need a fundamental shift from teaching to learning. And it starts with teachers, but it also starts with, it will only continue when we all start understanding the impact of language function on learning. Right? So, moving forward, we all need an open mind and a willingness to change, and we can. We can. Get the megaphone out. Don't be shy, and be brave. But the important thing is know why you're doing what you're doing. Okay, there's power in the theory. So everyone, that's pretty much what I spent 3 years doing.